Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. That was a little rough. Anybody who knows me knows I'm not really big on insects in general. So that sucked. I did play with arachnophobia mode on. I had a couple people ask me, why did you play in arachnophobia mode? So I turned it off for a bit. They didn't ask me after that. This is one of the best survival games I've ever played. I've talked about this recently with a friend of mine. There's a bit of a gradient between survival and build, and a lot of games sit somewhere on this gradient for which one they emphasize more. Some games have a bit of build gameplay, but really are far more focused on survival. Some games are I don't know. Of course, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Like Don't Starve. There you go. There's an example. And some games are focused far more over here on the build thing, like Satisfactory or Factorio, right? And some games hit somewhere in the middle. The game that this most reminds me of by a wide margin is Subnautica, a game I am hugely positive of and looking forward to doing a review of, both Subnautica and Subnautica 2, probably in about a month at our current rate. So sometime in December. So that's something to look forward to. But either way, if you've played Subnautica and you liked it, there's a pretty good chance you're going to like this one. I do want to add some caveats. So first of all, this game is gross. It's not horrifyingly gross, but it's definitely the kind of thing you're going to have to get used to seeing, bugs and insects and goop and death very up close for quite a while, actually. It is a little bit pasted over by what I can only refer to as this kind of shtick that makes it less horrifying than it should be. Actually, an inordinate quantity of fiction does this. But I tend to mentally think of this as the Borderlands effect. For anybody who's ever played Borderlands 1, 2, or 3, or pre-sequel, or Tales of, or the new Tales of, you'll know that setting really should be grimdark, right? Like really horrific, nightmarish, corporate overlords, life is cheap, death everywhere. Instead, it's all kind of treated as one big laugh, because it's effectively a parody. Fallout could arguably fall into this as well. You get the idea. So, whether or not something sits in that category or not depends entirely on how it's presented and not the actual content itself. I'll talk more about the story later, but I'm just mentioning this because this game could be much more horrifying with multiple children deaths and a child murderer as part of the plot than it actually is. And that's why. The kids are running around just having fun and doing an adventure because this is Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and it retains that kind of early 90s vibe to it, for good and for bad. But I'm here to talk about gameplay and gradient. So, Grounded is kind of straight in the middle. You do have to deal with things like enemies and resources and food and hunger and sleep and stamina and health. And there's armor and equipment and gear and tools and all sorts of stuff that you can get to progress and endure and push through the game. There is actually a campaign, there is a goal, there's progression. That's point number one. One of the biggest things for me about a survival game, because I've played quite a few, is the overwhelming majority of survival games for me get boring unless they have what I can only refer to as a campaign mode. One of the first ones I played that had that was Subnautica. But you get my point. There's a progression, there's a story, there's a way to move through the game rather than just sitting here and trying to survive and getting better and getting better. No judgment intended towards anybody who prefers a sandbox mode. That's fine. That's what it is. It's just, for me, sandbox games like that tend to immediately push me away because I quickly run out of things to do, and I'm like, well, okay, now what? That's just my style. I've always preferred developer-generated content over player-generated content. And this one is very, very much developer-generated content. There's lots to do. There is an inordinate quantity of things to explore and find and build, and there's tons of design. So I want to praise overworld design here for a second, because I don't even know where to begin with this. Okay, I hope you got all that. No, I'm going to fail here. If you saw it on camera, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And really, this is one of those situations where it's better to just show it to you. But that's what the streams are for. So what you're getting from me is a terrible description. A very large amount of thought was put into the bespoke level design. The art is a manually crafted place. And that allowed them to do so much with it. There are regions, there's territories. They can decide which resources are where, and allow a bit of flow of exploration to that and rewardant. They can make it so that, easy resources are here, medium resources are here. There's three clear tierings. There's the majority of the yard, there's the western half of the yard, or more like the western quarter of the yard, and then there's the northern part of the yard. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And there's a very clear flow, physically, literally, of how you progress through. Like, you want to get up to the northern part of the yard, where you're going to have access to a bomb, for example, which is something you'll have to get access to at this point. Once you get up there, you see the place is swarming with high-level Tier 1 enemies, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe I should come back here later. But even if you get to a certain point in that, what you're going to run into is a giant lava flow, effectively, of charcoal, which you're probably going to want to have fire-resistant gear or equipment, which is going to necessitate going to the Tier 2 area to be able to go through. There's natural roadblocks, in other words, rather than a literal wall that says, insert key to continue. The overwhelming majority of the prevention of progression throughout the game is all natural. And if you want to, you can just build a staircase up the wall and completely ignore everything I just mentioned, if you want to. You'll just have to deal with the much higher tier stuff up there. And it is much higher tier, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I'm just describing one of the ways in which the overworld is fantastic. The resources, the itemization, the enemy distribution, the enemy territories. Some enemies will actually patrol a territory if you have something built within their territory. So normally they'd leave you alone, but they'll come over and roam like, what's going on over here? Because there's stuff in their painted territory. And so they can be like, oh, what's going on over here? And that led to a couple of deaths on my part when I was first starting off. Cough, cough. But, then there's just the design of it, the resources, most of which respawn. The enemies respawn, although only after several days. The grass respawns, most of the pebbles respawn, the pond itself has stuff that respawns. There's very few non-respawning, in fact, I'm not sure there's any non-unique, non-respawning resources, so there's tons of places you can settle. There's natural height advantages. There's certain places which are clearly designed more for bases, some are more dangerous than others. All of them have basic base building resources in nearby. That's another thing. When I talk about resources, resource distribution in a game like this is extremely critical. It's why I praise the overworld design so much. Because you have to consider that your player can build, and will probably want to build, anywhere. Now, that doesn't mean you should make anywhere buildable. What it does mean is you should think about what is being built where and why, and put motivation areas. So rather than saying, this is your buildable terrain, and this is your buildable terrain, what they instead have is these two zones here have sprigs and plenty of grass and nearby water resources and clay and other things you need in order to build a base, whereas this plot does not. It's not like you can't build a base up there. And if you're paying attention, it's the same general design philosophy of what I talked about earlier when praising the overworld. It doesn't mandate, it encourages. Big distinction, very well done. I could just gush about the overworld. Just trust me when I say it's fantastic, which is a damned shame because now I'm going to talk about my biggest negative about the game by far. Traversal. Now, traversal is something that a lot of games actually get right. Spider-Man on the PS4, Shadow of War, is a good game for that. Just Cause 3 has good traversal. Traversal is the vehicle of how you get from point A to point B. And making that fun is a lot of what goes into any kind of explorative or open world game. Having a submarine or a spaceship or a cool car or well-designed roads or whatever, that's what can make traversal fun. Traversal is not fun in this game. I actually timed it at one point in time. There was a loop from our base to go across the yard, up the shovel, across the bench, in order to get down, this is after setting up a shortcut, mind you, down a zip line set to get up to the upper area in order to start going to the higher level zone, the Tier 3 zone. That was over 22 minutes of just walking. Oh, no, it's actually worse than that, because you're sprinting the whole time, and then pausing to get your stamina back, and then sprinting, and then pausing to get your stamina back. I'm not a big fan of stamina bars in general, I never have been, but that's a minor complaint compared to the 22 minutes of walking that this entails. It's insane. And that's kind of my overall point. That's it. That's how you traverse. The only exception is the zip line. Now, the zip lines came very close to being awesome. So the way a zipline works is you set one up here, you set one up here, and you connect them with a lot of silk, but silk is a replenishable resource, and it just comes from spider webs, which are all over the place, by the way. And then you zip down. Cool. It's a great way to add a degree of transport, especially since you can send logs, that is to say weed chunks and grass chunks down it. So one of the things we actually ended up doing was we had a logging area way over here, and its zip line went back to the base, and we had a section to catch the logs, and that way, we could build stuff at the base with resources we got over there. That's cool. I like that. There are a lot of problems with the zip lines. First of all, as previously mentioned, you get the zip lines pretty early. It's arguably one of the first dungeons you do, the hedge dungeon, which I believe is actually supposed to be the first dungeon you do. But after that, so zip lines need to have verticality. That's problem number one. An inordinate quantity of the guard is fairly flat, all things considered, and the grass gets more in the way than you'd think. Because not only do you have to have the verticality for the movement, but anything that gets in the way either blocks the line to begin with, or prevents you from going down it. So this actually happened to us several times. You can actually have a line of sight to the other thing, and you could have planned that out and mapped that. But as you actually go down it, if you brush up against some leaves that happen to be nearby, you immediately plummet. And, of course, those kind of things grow back, so if you want to have that particular line, you're going to have to maintain it. Otherwise, you're going to keep bumping into that, and so forth and so on. So that's problem one, verticality. Now, you can kind of get around the verticality with building, and we'll come back to that, but so there's the verticality thing, and then there's the resources thing. But then there's the fact that you kind of have to initially go there first and hope you've set it up properly. Because it's all just kind of eyeballing it, right? And if you've screwed it over, well, that sucks to be you, because recycling isn't 100% efficient in this game, so you only get some of the resources back. Now, there is actually a feature, which I'm going to mention here. You can move an item. Now, this is a great feature, and honestly, it would get more negatives if it didn't have this feature. Because then you can just pick something up and plop it down, as long as there's not something connecting to it, like one of the lines. But that's really, really useful when you have the pallets, which contain all the grass and all the weed chunks. You can just move the pallet over, and all the grass is still upon it, which is good, because otherwise hauling grass would be insane, because you can only hold 5 at a time, unless you have gear, which allows you to hold more. I know that's a lot of information, but my point in all of this is that there's just this kind of colossal hassle involved, and because of the vertical requirement, and because of the interrupt, and because of the resource investment, and because of the time investment, the only really feasible way to make this work is to find some place or way where you can build very high up for your main base, or spend a huge amount of time setting up way stations. To explain a little bit here, we'll go and grab the back scratcher. So imagine, here's the yard. Here's the back scratcher. Yes, this is a back scratcher, Laura. Here's the tower. So what you do is you have to build straight up with a vertical staircase. When I say straight up, I don't mean like 3 or 4 stories. I mean like 20 stories. Because again, you need to not only get above the grass, you need to get substantially above the grass. And the grass is everywhere. So the grass line, you need to be way up here. So that is a huge and costly project per tower. Then once you get up, you drop a line at the top, and then you drop a line at the bottom. And the idea here is that you then go and make another tower over here, and then you make another tower over here, and so forth and so on. As many towers as you want to. This is, of course, up to you. And so then you could have a line going from each tower to each tower, because each zip line can take 5 connections. So up here you go down to the 5 nearest towers. And so the idea eventually is you're kind of making a pseudo waypoint system of zzz, and then you go up, zzz, and then you go up, zzz. And even the way I'm describing that probably sounds cool, but trust me, it's still kind of arduous, which is my overall point. Something we stumbled upon, and I do mean stumbled upon, is by far a much better method is to just make staircases. Just straight up make staircases that bypass most of the terrain. I know that's a weird thing to do, but when you get to the point where you're just trying to harvest resources or get back to the zone you were in quickly, just having a straight route there is really helpful. So that's my advice on that front. So the overworld is very well designed. The zip lines kind of suck. Traversal mega sucks. I don't like to criticize without critiquing. How would they make zip lines better? That's easy, really. Add some kind of science solution, of which there are probably plenty, where you can make it go upwards. Right now, the zipline has to have verticality. By the way, this also affects your speed. So if you have a zipline where you're only barely above where you're going, your speed going along this will be crawling. In fact, I actually set up one zipline at one point, which I was like, yes, it's finally done. Got way to the top of the bird bath, set up the zipline, and it was so slow, some people actually thought the game was bugging out. So it's another problem. So set up some kind of winder or something, like you could wind it up. And not only could that speed up the trip, so you could, go with those kind of horizontal things, but actually make it so you could go uphill. So you, and then you could actually go up, and that would massively increase the options for zipline usage throughout the game. Another thing you could do is add freaking mounts. Make it so that different mount harnesses and resources, because there's already a pet system in the game, each have their own requirements in terms of resources, which means you can only get them at a certain point of the game. Early game, mid-game, late game. So, have ants early on, which are just faster. Probably have spiders for the middle tier, who can climb on things. And probably have a frickin' bee for tier 3, who can just fly around and have access to the map. That would hugely smooth out the late game, because as much as I love this game to death, the late game kind of sucks. So the early game is fantastic. I have nothing but praise for early game. Mid game, they really start to branch out and you have a lot more options with what you can build and what you can design and what you can do. Late game is a grind. It is a straight up grind. You start to need not only rare resources, but resources which only spawn in one specific spot, which is way over there and is not just a huge trip, but it's an irritating trip because you can't just beeline. You're actually doing something like this, because the terrain on all the upper levels is designed to be frustrating to maneuver through. It's probably supposed to be the end level zone, which makes sense, because it is. But then you've got the non-stop, like, in most of the earlier zones, there's a lot of enemies that don't aggro you. They're just there. There are some that do, of course, there's some dangers. But for the most part, if you don't start nothing, there isn't anything. In the upper zone, in the higher level zone, in fact, I only encountered one enemy that does not attack on sight. Some of those enemies slow you. Some of those enemies absolutely swarm you. And some of those enemies run when you attack them back and go get reinforcements. All of this just makes traveling through the Dire Lands a huge, colossal slog. So, that's on top of the overtuning problem. Even when we had a 4-player kill squad with decent tier 2 gear, we would go hunting for enemies to get tier 3 equipment, right? To get their drops, to be able to build tier 3 gear. And we're fighting this thing. And then one other enemy aggros. And we wiped. We died because one additional enemy showed up, with 4 of us in decent gear. In the best gear that we could get at the time, actually. Because the only better gear was the tier 3 gear we were trying to get. The overtuning is a problem. The traversal is a problem. There's some padding issues later on. But that's about it as far as negatives. I love the way the scanning system works. So you're encouraged to find all these little different nodes throughout the map. And unlocking them seemingly doesn't do anything until you open up the scanning network. And from that point onward, you could scan for specific resources. And anywhere within your sensor range, which is expanded by each node you have, is a place you can scan within. And you can scan for static resources like stuff on the ground, or enemies by searching for things that those enemies drop. This encourages you to scan, to analyze, to find the new nodes, and to be able to look up the map and say, aha, it's there. And it's not just on the map, although it stays on the map. You can also then put a waypoint to say, I want to go straight to this spot and find it. It's a hugely convenient system, which, despite the irritations I just mentioned, is the next big thing I want to tell you about. This game has a ton of quality of life features. I have never played an Obsidian game that was this smooth to play. Obsidian games, in my experience, are great games buried by irritation, right? I mean, you go to KOTOR 2, or you go to Neverwinter Nights 2, or you go to Alpha Protocol, or you go to Pillars of Eternity, and there's just always something getting in the way of me playing the game and having fun with it. In virtually every case, this is the smoothest experience, and the most bug-free, ironically, experience I've ever had with an Obsidian game. So, tons of quality of life changes. You can literally, like, you pull up the crafting menu, you can craft within the crafting menu. The blueprint system is fantastic, so you can lay down blueprints and then fill in the blueprints with the resources you need, so you can actually map out what you need to build before you build it, which is awesome. You can, there's so much. There's so many different resources, and you can paint them, you can design them, you can make something cool, you can make something practical, you can make something functional, you can build multiple bases all over the place. There's defenses that you can set up. There's tower defense modes, which kind of suck, but they're there. There's a decent variety of enemies, a huge variety of just stuff to find and explore, and it's fun to do so. This is a 44.44 hour game for me, which is huge for a game of this style. And for very little of that was let me structure that a little better. For most of that, I was having fun. But that leads us to the last negative I do need to mention, the co-op. I know that sounds weird, but bear with me for a second, please. Is there co-op? Yes. Is the co-op fun? Yes. Is the co-op mandatory? Kinda. This is a game balanced around 3 to 4 players. If you have 3 or 4 players, you're fine. If you have 2, if you are by yourself, every problem I just mentioned is magnified 100-fold. Let me describe, I'm not going to talk about like enemy design or stuff like that, because there are problems with that. Enemy health and damage and all that is designed around you having a party, so if you're solo, everything gets much worse on that front. But let me describe something very simple for you. Let's say you're trying to build a bridge. Well, let's say you don't want to be fancy. So you just need grass blocks, and you need to make them across this area. That's it. Very simple. So what you need to do, if you're alone, is you go gather resources to make a pallet, carry the pallet with you to the area, chop down a bunch of trees, load up the pallet, chop, 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 load, 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 chop, 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 load, 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 chop, 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 load, load, load. Take you about, 6 or 7 loads to do that. Pick up the pallet, carry it over, grab, build, grab, build, grab, build, grab, build. Now that probably doesn't sound like much, but when you're doing, that's one of the most basic projects I can think of. When you're doing anything of any substance, all of this obviously increases exponentially, especially when you need more than just one resource. Let's explain that exact same scenario with just 2 people. Just 2. So this person is over here. They're doing the blueprints, mapping out the bridge and where it's going to go. This person has gone over here to fill up the pallet. They have now filled up the pallet, right? Or actually, let's be more efficient about that. Hang on, we can be even more efficient. So they both help plan out the bridge. The 2 go over with the pallet, chop down, so we now have double the rate of getting the grass on the pallet. Then one of them leaves, takes the pallet over here, pulls it all off, drops it on the floor, and starts building the bridge, while the other person goes, grabs the pallet, and starts filling it up with a second load, because you're going to need more than one load, in order to bring it back. So this person will then be able to build, and then immediately continue building, and you get it. Now you get into the really complex situations, where you're building houses or fortresses, or staircases or zip lines, and all of a sudden having 4 people streamlines the process substantially. I can't tell you the difference it was, because I was actually working on a staircase to go up to the upper area when one of my friends came over to help me out. And it went from being this slog fest to, all right, grab, and we just started doing this as we just kind of kept the production chain going, and then we were done. It was night and day, and that was just 2 people. When you actually have 4 people properly coordinated, it runs like butter. That's a weird sentence, but I'm going to stick by it. This game is very, very, very clearly designed around co-op, which is okay, good, and proper, except for the fact that it's so designed around co-op that you're going to have a detriment if you're playing by yourself. There's no bots, there's no convenience features, there's nothing to smooth out the experience if you're by yourself. This is not like Deep Rock Galactic where you have the bot. This is not like Left 4 Dead where the AI can run the other players. You are completely by yourself, the end. And that does kind of suck. And I wanted to mention that because I should have said this first, I apologize. It's the biggest proviso, really, to the entire game. If you have friends, even just one friend, but if you have the full 4 group, you're good. Have fun with it. Seriously, I highly recommend it. But if you don't, Ugh. I could keep talking. I could keep gushing. I just pull up my review here. What do we got here? Visual continuity. I love this. This is something I like about Subnautica and this both, although this game does it better, to be completely blunt. At any point in time, if you can see out into the yard in any level, you know where you are in the yard, even without the map. There's no compass in this game, which actually kind of sucks, but you don't really need it. The tree is always visible. The house is always visible. The shed is always visible. You have landmarks, and you can divine where you're at almost immediately, unless you're underground, completely under the underbrush, or in one of the dungeons. I mentioned dungeon design. I gushed about the overworld so much. The dungeons are generally well designed. Most of them are centered around the story labs, but there's also some really cool boss fights. I know. There's really cool boss fights in a survival game, in an Obsidian game, but here we are. They are, though. They're fun. They're interesting. They're engaging. They're multifaceted. They've got gimmicks and phases and cool stuff. It's awesome. I had fun with it. We actually, for those of you curious, we did go after the three optional bosses, which brings the total number of bosses up to 4, I want to say. Nope, that's wrong. 5. There are 5 bosses in the game. 3 of them are optional. I highly recommend going after them. They're fun fights. I could talk about other things, but let's transition over to the narrative. But I wanted to emphasize this so much, because to really get this across, this is an Obsidian game which has really good gameplay. Plus 31 net points to gameplay. That's huge. Now, that's not that great for a survival... I mean, that is great for a survival game. But I'm just saying, for an Obsidian game, I'm shocked at how good the gameplay is. The story is also good. I don't really have any complaints about it. It's just not as good, because there's just not as much of it. The voice acting for the main scientist character is awesome. His slow descent into insanity is awesome. The nightmarish horror is awesome. I think it's about it. Let me pull up my own notes here really quick. What else do we got? No, that's kind of it. This game is weird. I mentioned the Borderlands thing earlier. This game is so messed up and so much... Like, this could be easily a horror game. It's not, because of that Borderlands thing, because it's just kind of treated like a joke. Like this one... I don't want to spoil at all, but let's just say that one of the characters in this game is going through this debilitating disease that is slowly destroying them. And it's treated like a joke. And that's all I really need to add to that. That's just kind of where that's at. But there were several labs where we're going through and listening to the audio files, Bioshock style. And chat and myself are just sitting here going, oh my God! What? But, why? Why would you do that? And of course, we caused the apocalypse. So that's cool too. Although, personal headcanon, as soon as we grew back to normal size, we immediately grabbed a flamethrower and scorched earth that yard to the ground. If you've played it, you know why. This has been a very fun experience, and I hope that at least some of you are convinced to try this game out, especially, again, if you have friends to play it with. Otherwise, next up we're covering Fallout. I'll see you then.